And so he's the current director of Dakshin Foundation. For years, he has been engaged with the regional, national, and local agencies, including the government and the NGO sectors, dealing with marine biota. He heads the Biodiversity and Resource Monitoring Program and the oversees the establishment and has also implemented several marine conservation projects at Dakshin's field sites, which include the community-led fishery management in Lakshadweep, the citizen science programs in Andaman, and the long-term monitoring of coral ecosystems in the Andamans. Not only this, he extends his efforts to build Dakshin's environmental education program, and he also oversaw the production of his publication Treasured Islands. From being an editorial board member at the current Science to being an invited member at the Aquaculture and Marine Biotechnology Task Force of Department of Biotechnology and Government of India, we are so fortunate to have you here, sir. Also, for the participants, please mark your questions and Dr. Naveen would be taking them in the end. Do mute yourselves and during the session, if you have any doubts, just put them in the chat box and we'll be taking them ahead. And welcome, sir. Let's begin.
Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, now I can see I'm looking all blurred. Let me see if I can change my background. Is it fine if I go ahead like this?
Yes, sir. It's okay.
Or just give me a second. Just a
Sure,
second.
sir.
Yeah, I'll go ahead with this. So, hi, I'm Naveen. Like, Simran mentioned, I'm a founder, trustee, and a director at Dakshin, a marine biologist by training, and started working in marine with marine ecosystems back in early 2000. Actually 2000 is when I started working on coastal and marine systems in Andaman, mostly in the Nicobar Islands, is on reef ecosystems is where I did my PhD from. Yeah, so from there got involved in a lot of conservation related projects, and then Dakshin happened and have been associated with Dakshin for the last 12 odd years. Yeah, so I'm supposed to be speaking about citizen science here. So not I mean, most of my experiences with I wouldn't say citizen science initiatives. I'm still struggling to figure out how to define some of the projects. Like some of them strictly fall under how citizen science is normally con- you know understood, or within the usual definitions of citizen science as is right now. But some of the other projects that I'm going to talk about, not very clear where exactly they sit, but that's something that we can talk about and discuss. But yeah, so I'll share some of my personal experiences and mostly wrap up with a few questions. I can see some familiar names here on the participants list, and those who've already seen these presentations, please bear with it, or feel free to you know decide whether you want to sit through this again all over again. But overall, the what has been the main point that I've really been wanting to communicate, because citizen science is becoming a very popular tool increasingly, especially in ecological research, or work that involves uh, you know monitoring of systems, natural systems, or even sometimes even in other kinds of work like lab work and things like that, we do increasingly start looking at citizen science as a potential way to involve more people. But it's also critical to think you know about certain basic things like a for instance inclusivity. How do you ensure that you're, especially in countries like India, in developing countries like India, where inequity is so high, from social inequities, there's caste-based or cultural kind of inequities that exist in. There's economic inequities. There's all kinds of inequities that one can think of, and it's a very diverse and very diverse social, cultural, economic system. So within these systems, when we're planning initiatives that involve communities, involve people to come on board, it's really critical to think of some very fundamental questions of how, why, and what is it that we're doing with our initiative. So yeah, on that note, I will start my presentation. Ah, sorry, where's the full screen mode? Yeah, finally. So um yeah, I just largely titled this as as a talk that is meant to trigger a lot more questions about citizen science, not necessarily to give answers, but at least initiate certain thought processes when a lot of us are thinking about citizen science as a potential way to engage communities to improve data availability and things like that. So to begin with, it will be good if all the participants here, I would request all the participants or whoever is, who has given this some thought, to put down in the chat box in words or in short lines, what is it that you think of when you think of citizen science? What is it that comes to mind? What does the word citizen science mean to you? So if I could request, all of you to put your thoughts down in the chat box. We'll get back to that towards the end of the once I've shared some of the case studies that I wanted to, and then let's get into this conversation of citizen science. But I thought I'll ask you to start thinking about it and putting you know your keywords or lines down in the chat box. Yeah. So I'll straight away get into three case studies that I've been involved with, in some in my individual capacity, some through the organization's you know collective efforts. Um, so the one on the left is a basically a community mapping that was done in a place called Panayur. This is a small fishing hamlet in on the southeast coast of India, Tamil Nadu, south of Chennai. From Chennai to Pondicherry on the highway, there's a lot of, it runs along it's called the East Coast Road. So it's a coastal road, and you'll see this village is somewhere on that coastal road, closer to Mahabalipuram. And the center one is our experiences having worked with fisher communities in Lakshadweep Islands, where communities are involved in a particular kind of fishing called the pole and line tuna fishing, which is a sustainable, one of the most sustainable kind of fishing practices, very low impact, ecologically low impact kind of a fishing practice that's been carried out in Lakshadweep. And the last one is the reef log initiative, which is something that I would place happily place under the citizen science initiatives, as most perceive it, or think of it. This is a participatory program where whoever's involved in recreational diving can, you know, be part of of this program and can just contribute data sets. There's a bunch of, I'll talk about each of these a little bit more in detail later. So coming to the first example from Tamil Nadu, this is Panayur Periyakuppam. There's a large, uh, you know, there's a huge thermal power plant that was planned in these areas with a lot of, coal-based power production, and there's large amounts of land acquisition and all of that that was in the pipelines. There were large areas identified in and around these areas. I mean, this is just the coastline that I've showed in the map, but there's a fair amount of land in the hinterland that was also set aside for this pretty large, uh, you know, thermal power plant that was supposed to come. And the port through which the coal for the power plant would come was supposed to be set up at this village called Panayur Periyakuppam. And there was an EIA study that was conducted, and an environmental impact assessment study that was commissioned by the project proponents, and that happened. And then when the EIA report came out, there were lots of problems in it. So it reported that there are no sand dunes, particularly sand dunes, because wherever there are sand dunes, they come under the category CRZ1. CRZ is Coastal Regulation Zone Act, and that's the only legal instrument available to manage what's being done on the coastline. That's the only legal instrument that sits under the Wildlife Protection Act. So CRZ declares all these areas that have, sand dunes as CRZ1, which is, no development zones, or very difficult to get any kind of clearances for those zones. So, but the EIA report completely, ignored the presence, or didn't even report about the presence of sand dunes conveniently. So, uh, a partner NGO who's been working there with a lot of these communities for a fairly long time got in touch with us and wanted to run wanted to critically assess the EIA report. And I've been to these sites, so I know that these are places with excellent sand dune ecosystems. And that's when we decided to do a small, very simple study with like a monitoring exercise with the local communities there. Um, we went there in the morning, trained the local village communities, told them what we're planning to do here is to contest the environmental impact assessment, and contest that in the court of law, particularly claiming that there are extensive sand dune ecosystems here, so you cannot, you know, build on in these areas without getting the necessary clearances to build in CRZ1. So the communities were trained in this very simple method of profiling beaches, and from the sand dune onwards, these all the way down to the low tide line, these communities map the profile. So it's basically the vertical profile of the beach, which then shows that there are, large dune systems on the coastline. And they managed to do that in a started the training in the morning, and by afternoon, they had finished collecting data for 5 transects. And it was a very simple one-off study, but it did show that, there are significant, uh, you know, significant presence of sand dunes in those areas. So up to a height of 11 and a half to, 12 meters in some places even more, quite wide and extensive sand dune systems as well. Some like more than half a kilometer wide. So these are fairly large sand dune ecosystems, and dune ecosystems also do provide very critical services in coastal areas. So, for instance, they're the best defense against cyclones and storms and all of that, because sand is the best absorbent of wave energy. So even during the tsunami and other cyclones that had hit the east coast of India, there's clear evidence that places with sand dunes have performed much, much better than, say, even ones with, say, shelter belts like casuarina plantations or mangroves and other systems. So from a coastal, vulnerability and a protection point of view, these are critical. Equally important is other kinds of services they provide, like salinity intrusion is something that they regulate very strongly. They have excellent sinks for fresh water. So every time it rains, the sand immediately absorbs the water and adds it to the water table. So in a way, keeping the salinity that seeps in from through the groundwater also at bay. So despite all these, which is why they've been listed under CRZ1 for that matter. So it clearly indicated that there are extensive sand dunes in these areas. And that's pretty much it. The okay, sorry, and that ended up in a small report that was co-authored by me and all the local villagers and others who were involved in the monitoring program. And this was presented as an evidence in the court of law and as one of the evidences in the court of law. And it was, for now, that entire project has been put on hold till all the EIAs, all these issues are all sorted out and the proper assessment is done. Cost benefit ratios, all of that is well questioned. So, but from a, you know, from the community side, they've managed to, at least for the time being, get some kind of protection against a port coming up right in front of their village and them getting displaced from there. Um, so I wouldn't know if one would call it a citizen science initiative. This was just a one-off thing. It was done entirely to cater to an immediate and imminent kind of issue or challenge that the communities were facing. I wouldn't know. I mean, I know that some of the people who are involved in that uh, monitoring program and learned how to do the profiling of the beach have taken that and tried and implemented it along many other coastlines where sand dunes are present, and gone ahead and mapped those sand dunes in their areas and you know put them out as reports and stuff like that to make it, to set aside those areas for to prevent further development initiatives coming in those areas. So some folks have used it, but that was entirely on their own initiative, and it's not going into any central database that contributes to to a larger understanding. And this was entirely done as a tool for a community to address a certain you know challenge, that was threat that was looming in front of them, right? So that's one. And next is the case study that I'd like to share is from Lakshadweep Islands, where Dakshin Foundation has been working for the last 6 years or more, close to 7 years now. Like I said, one of the main, so Lakshadweep is this group of small, tiny atolls in the Arabian Sea, and an extension of the Maldivian, archipelago, the Chagos Maldivian, that ridge that uh, runs in the Arabian Sea. Um, the Lakshadweep community are a very literate community, more than 99 percentage literacy, more than 97, 98. I think one of the second highest literacy level in the communities. I mean, in terms of literacy level, they are one of the most literate communities. Quite a homogeneous system. I don't know if you all have been following any of the updates on what's happening in the Lakshadweep. Situations is quite problematic there, but generally as a community, they're quite homogeneous. There are island level variations, but overall, a strongly Islamic community. They follow a matrilineal system. So, it's a very interesting, homogeneous community, comparatively, relatively more homogeneous community than many other communities you'd say probably encounter in a place like on mainland India, say along the coast of Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, wherever it is, right? So yeah, and like I said, this is Poland line tuna fishing is the fisheries they practice there. It has literally no bycatch. They target this species called skipjack tuna, which have high species turnover rates, highly fecund and quickly maturing species. So that way, one of those tuna species that can be sustainably harvested. So that's pretty much what the fishing practice that they follow. They because of this fisheries, works that some of our other colleagues who work in the Lakshadweep and have been working there for even longer on reef ecosystems and other systems also mention is that this is a fishing practice that has kept fishing pressure off reefs because tuna is found in the open ocean, not so much on the coral reefs. And these are basically atoll systems. I don't know if you all know, but atolls are basically coral islands that have slowly, been uplifted or, come above the sea level. So their entire survival depends on the health of the reef ecosystems because once the reef and there is a lagoon, which means there's a large long ring of corals that um, where can I show this? Yeah, so if you look at this particular island called Minicoy, the inhabitable land is only this tiny stretch, but the entire atoll includes there'll be a ring of corals growing around here, and then a shallow lagoon inside, and then the deep ocean is somewhere on the outside. So this entire lagoon and the inhabitable part, which is the exposed island, these are all basically structures that are formed by corals. So literally the communities are living on coral. So for them, fishing in the reef itself could have huge implications for reef health. And because they practice this particular type of fishing, they haven't been fishing as much on the reef as probably other areas in other reef areas they practice. So in a way, it's been a fishery that has diverted the fishing pressure of the reefs, and barely any impact on the habitats as well. They do collect bait from the lagoons, and they use live baits. They carry bait as alive in their tanks, and then go and chum the water, basically spray water and then throw the bait into the water. So which gets the tuna into a frenzy. So that's how they catch the tuna. And yeah, so while they collect the bait, there are some habitat impacts on the shallow lagoon areas, but again not so drastic as probably a well-established reef fishery. Now this fishery has been going through, despite being a very sustainable fisheries, it has been going through a lot of transitions of late. Um, like I said, the bait that they need to catch the tuna, their quantities have been declining because there have been some unsustainable practices that have come into harvesting the bait. And then there have been other issues like there's no availability of data. There are other the center, which is from at the central level, there is a sense that India is not tapping into all the offshore resources in terms of the fish resources that's available to us. So there's a large drive to scale up the fisheries in Lakshadweep. And they consider the pole and line tuna fishing as a more primitive kind of a fishing practice. So they'd like to make it more mechanized and more, industrialized kind of a fishing, uh, you know, so it's kind of pushing the sustainable fisheries down a trajectory of, unsustainability. So what we've been trying to do is work with the fisher communities too. And there are economic challenges as well to sustain the fisheries because the bait is quantities are going down. They have to go more than 8 to 10 hours to catch the bait and then come back to catch tuna, which is just say half an hour away. So for them, they wanted, and the returns they get per fish because there's no post-harvest technology, which means refrigeration technology and all of that, which is critical because fish is a perishable product. So what happens because those facilities are not there, they're forced to convert it into dried fish and then sell it as what they call mass meat locally is a dried fish, dried tuna that they sell. This has huge demand in Sri Lanka and in Southeast Asian market. So that's the main thing. But that entire commerce is regulated by a few middlemen on the island. So that has its own economic problem. So we've been working with the fisher communities to help address some of these gaps. That data gap was something that everyone felt was affecting the fisheries because um, the fisheries department that has the mandate of collecting that data is unable to do it across all islands and on a day-to-day basis. So some of the data sets are not so reliable. So what we started is to have started with is by having conversations with communities, and data gap did come up as a serious issue. And the other problem is the non-involvement of fisher communities in any of these conversations. When it comes to managing fisheries in a particular area, for some reason the fisher communities were involved in the resource harvest and never part of these conversations. So, and despite the fact that they are, people with excellent understanding of what's happening in the ocean, so be it weather patterns, availability of fish resource, where to go and fish, what to fish. They make these day-to-day observations on conditions on the sea. They know exactly what is going on in terms of fishing effort. So, but unfortunately, nobody is tapping into that, you know, or leveraging those existing knowledge systems. It may not be codified in the way data is codified, and contemporarily how we do practice science. It doesn't, their knowledge system is not compatible with this kind of you know data heavy kind of uh, you know way how fishery science works, right? So there are those inherent incompatibilities as well. And you know the fact that uh, just in terms of monitoring, right, fisher communities have huge roles to play in monitoring and regulation and enforcement. You want communities to comply to the rules, but then they're never part of the rule making, leads to huge problems in terms of people's buy-in into the decisions that are being made to manage fish stocks and all of that. So our plan is to also use monitoring not just as a tool to collect data, but also as a tool to involve communities in larger conversations, and not to have to rely on scientists to come and decide what's happening with their fish stocks when they themselves are very well aware of it. So there's also knowledge is also power, right? Data, knowledge, all of these things are power. So there's a certain concentration of powers within the practitioners of contemporary science, because of this imbalance in between. Okay, you have a traditional local ecological knowledge, mine is actually data evidence based knowledge. you know so there's always this power dynamics in which there's always the contemporary science based evidence based kind of data knowledge systems have more power over. And even when it comes to decision making, management decisions, or resource conservation related decision making, all of that, we always rely on this particular data set and not look at other data sets that may not be codified in data and other things, but I wouldn't say they are not evidence, without any evidence. They're clearly systems that have worked and have worked iteratively and evolved as well over periods of time. So there's this disconnect between the actual people who go out and practice fishing and how fisheries management is done, right? And there are, like I said, there are all these other incompatibilities as well when it comes to how data and generally science is looked at. So when you say citizen science, science already has a certain connotation when we're thinking of it, right? And we want citizens to participate in something like that, but not everyone speak the language of data, don't speak the language of you know of frameworks, or or study design, or why should be data be collected in a certain manner. All these things are things that we who, as practitioners of science, we are comfortable with this language, even though we're all speaking English. But some of these things are still language barriers of sorts, right? So even though you speak the same vernacular language, there are differences in how we we communicate as well in within those languages. And then there are, like I said, those systemic incompatibilities between local ecological knowledge and science and all of that. And sometimes there are so many prerequisites to be part of these initiatives, right? You, like I said, in the context setting for Lakshadweep, is that there's a very literate community. So they didn't have, when we were talking to them about doing some kind of a monitoring exercise and address these data gaps, they didn't have too many inhibitions, because they're very literate and confident in engaging with tables, numbers, and all of that. And yeah, so we did have, so we did look at monitoring as a bridge to kind of see how we can break down these incompatibilities and see how you can also facilitate not just one way flow of information, but also to try and see how we can make it a two-way exchange of knowledge, right? And we had multiple meetings and conversations with fisher communities in Lakshadweep. We discussed the whole need for data. Why is data in a certain format? How is it helpful? What does it help tell you in current day and age? Why is it useful to have some data sets and all of that? And over a period of time, the data set itself was co-created. So the communities themselves wanted to find out many things, and wanted to collect information on those things. Just to give you an example, they wanted to know how, say for instance, what you call fish aggregation devices work. There's a fair bit of money being spent on establishing these fish aggregation devices out in the open sea. And sometimes the communities themselves invest, or sometimes it's the fisheries department who, through schemes and subsidies and other in other ways, they help facilitate establishment of these fish aggregation devices, which tend to concentrate tuna schools around those. It's just basically something that floats on the surface, and it's more to the bottom of the sea floor. And then, the tuna tend to aggregate there. But the fisher communities themselves had observed that the fish that they catch near the FADs were either small in size or not very healthy. So they themselves wanted to, they had these questions. So the point is that it was a co-created kind of a monitoring protocol to ensure that the communities, what they wanted to know about their own systems, were also incorporated into it. And then the whole concept of, so if you want to know what's happening with your fish stocks, you need to know what's happening. There's a unit metric called catch per unit effort that's commonly used in fisheries sciences to understand. So you track your catch, and you quantify your catch. That's not sufficient to know what's happening in terms of trends. You also need to know how much you caught with how much, what is the input of effort that has gone into it. And effort is quantified in multiple ways. So we had to break down these concepts to the communities. But like I said, they were not hesitant in engaging in all these conversations, and we put together this protocol collectively. It was operated for 4 years on 4 islands. I think now about 50 boats have been involved, more than close to 5,000 odd records are there. So it was a co-created monitoring program. We were the facilitators of helping build this together, but we also play the role of collecting this information. It's in the form of these notebooks that they preferred entering the data. But once we had all our work in terms of having to collect this, analyze this, and give it back to the community. So that's something that we've been doing year on year. um, there's no monetary incentive whatsoever, but the only incentive that we have, I'll talk about that towards the end. And the agreement we had with the fisher community is that when in the first year when we implemented it, we noticed that a lot of the data sets that were being given were a bit dubious, or not entered properly. And when we inquired, we figured out that participants have not been entering the data sets regularly. So when we go and ask, they tend to just quickly recollect from whatever they remembered, and try to enter these data sets, and give it back to us, not out of wanting to fudge the data, but because they feel a certain obligation that, okay, I've committed to this, now I haven't given anything. So the deal we had with the community is that you give us the data set only if you're confident that it's reliable and correct. Otherwise, there's no pressure on anybody to contribute to this. And in return, the agreement was that none of these data sets would be traceable back to a particular board. We won't share their identities, and anonymity will be maintained. That was the agreement. Some of the results from the data sets that we had collected, this is with the bait that I was talking about. This was something that they had flagged as a critical resource to be monitored. And they use different kinds of baits. So this is like a breakdown of how they've been using different species of baits at different times. As you can see, this is something that they wanted to know is, particularly what amount of spawning stocks are they targeting in a particular year, right? Because these are harvesting them during their spawning period is an extremely problematic thing from a sustainability point of view. So, yeah, some interesting insights from there. This is what I mentioned about the fish aggregation devices that the communities wanted to monitor. And what we found is that with skipjack tuna, the primary catch that these communities rely on, uh, their their sizes didn't vary so significantly. The ones closer to the FADs were slightly smaller than the ones that were not associated with fish aggregation devices. But in the case of yellowfin tuna, which is again a, a, a resource that the local islanders target when skipjack populations are lesser or their markets go down. Yellowfin tuna is another resource they target, not using pole and line, but using other methods. Um, the size of yellowfin tuna was significantly different from the ones closer to the FADs from and the ones that were not associated with FADs. And likewise, island-wise variations. We as mentioned that four islands we were looking at, so there were some island level variations also in terms of how much tuna was being landed, right? So some of the findings that had come out of those studies, there are more data sets that need updating. Um, I mentioned about the incentives for fisher communities in participating in our initiative. Uh, the one thing that we do regularly is to publish these calendars annually. And on these calendars, at least 10 boats who've been, regular participants, best contributors in terms of, data sets and things like that, their boats and owners, their pictures and everything is kind of showcased in for every month, right? Every month sheet, it'll contain their picture of their boat and other things. We also use the calendar for sharing the information back from the thing, but each and every boat receives a personalized, if they've contributed data sets, they receive like a personalized analyzed data back. And it will also contain island level averages and Lakshadweep, the entire archipelago wide averages. So for us over the few years, it's been a lot of ups and downs. There have been people who participated, dropped out. Sometimes boats have offered to do it but never managed to collect data. Been enthusiastic at the top at the beginning and then slowly losing steam. All kinds of things, ups and downs have we've gone through in our initiate in our monitoring efforts. But the biggest thing is it helped facilitate a lot of other conversations. Every time you get a data set analyzed after every season, when we go back to the communities and share this information back, it is excellent fodder for a lot of conversations around sustainability, long-term sustainability, risk sharing of resources, all these critical things that one need to discuss. These things facilitate it and they themselves are able to see it. So if a fisher person is able to understand very well what's happening on his or her boat at the boat level, they're able to understand it. But when it comes to they know the trends perfectly well, what has happened, how much fish have they harvested, what's the investment they put in, how much of returns have they gotten, all of that they know at their own boat level. But they were very interested in knowing what was happening at an island level, and they were even more interested to know what was happening entirely at the Lakshadweep level. So so for us, it led to so many useful conversations about fisheries management. The main thing being the bait fish resource that I was talking about, which was one of those things that were pushing them to go down on sustainable pathways. So reef fishing was slowly starting to increase. Other kinds of yellowfin and other long-lived tuna species were being targeted more. So, and people were slowly phasing out of pole and line tuna fishing. So, and mainly because of this bait fish crisis. So, in a way, through these monitoring programs, we were able to have a lot of conversations, and we what you call it, through a co-management framework. A co-management framework is basically like a multi-stakeholder platform where things are collectively decided, right? I mean, what to do with your resources, how do you manage it, how do you go about it. So interestingly, the communities themselves, as part of our co-management conversations, decided to ban at least two or three practices. I mean, these are more easier things that could have been, that were, these are things that were easier to ban in any case. No one was supportive of those practices, but because the other one is practicing it and getting better benefits out of it, the rest are forced to get on to that same and practice those same things. Like, one for instance is night fishing, where you use heavy, massive, powerful LED lights during the dusk or dawn to attract bait, and then just circle them and take them out. And that's not a sustainable fishing practice, and they themselves are aware of it, but they cannot stop, because if even if one person stops it, the other is not going to stop. So these collective decision making, uh, you know was something that we facilitated, and they decided to ban night fishing. The local administration offered to send a government order supporting these decisions, but then the COVID ban and all of that happened, so that didn't happen yet. But the whole plan is to get the various monitoring management agencies and the actual resource dependent communities to come together and make decisions. And that's, I think, like one of the key outcomes of a monitoring program is to have led to this. So for us, it was more like a bridge that helped us get into actual management decisions through, a monitoring program. That's for Lakshadweep. And then the other island systems, which is an entirely different kind of an island system in altogether, is the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where we've been working for, like I said, from my PhD days onwards on these islands. And it's a very popular dive destination, and not just for Indians, internationally as well. So increasing number of presence of dive operations, dive outfits on these islands. So we decided to launch a reef log program, which is basically, you know, using certain species that are indicative of what's happening on the reef system. So these are groupers, the large carnivores that you commonly find on reef systems, but also species that are heavily targeted. So indicative of fishing pressure, indicative of what's happening at the higher food chain levels. And then we had invertivores, herbivores like parrotfish, bumphead parrotfish, and others. Smaller invertivores or corallivores like your butterfly fish and things like that. So, and then invertebrates as well. All of these are like strong indicators of what's happening on reefs. For instance, crown of thorns is a particular starfish that feeds on live coral polyps, or urchins are like, ones that break down reef structures in high densities. They can actually break down the entire three-dimensional structure of a reef into a two-dimensional structure. So we pick these key indicator species, and very simple protocols of putting a tick mark, tick mark or some kind of a line or something, and then it's just a count of the number of things they've encountered. There are some special events also that they're supposed to record as part of this. And the plan was to operate it through dive shops who are already there and run these operations, and give also involve some kind of incentivization through some certificates, or other kinds of you know badges and things that could go along with it, right? So those are the different categories we picked. And yeah, like I said, fairly simple, straightforward logging procedures. Yeah, so that's how the reflog program has been operating. We're setting up a website and all of that to make it, you know, and this is how typically most citizen science initiatives, the ones that I've seen more commonly, are structured. Is that you give these clear things, and there's no co-creation or anything involved here. It's just that people come in, they have some time, they have the opportunity to dive. Not everybody gets a chance to dive, so you're looking at a certain socioeconomic class who can afford traveling to these islands, exotic places, and afford to dive. And assuming that they would also have a certain, whatever, altruistic leanings to contribute to the areas that they're going and visiting. So based on those assumptions is how this particular program is built, right? So just to kind of summarize how these things are, looking, how do I make this bar on the top disappear? Okay, anyway, I'm moving down. So there are those three examples that I gave, right? So if one were to go back and think about what is it that motivated each of these programs, you know, in the example of Panayur in Tamil Nadu, it's very clear it was primarily, some kind of injustice happening. People wanted to stake their rights or claims over a certain area, ensure that they were not on the receiving end you know, of, some development activities and getting displaced and all of that. For Lakshadweep, folks wanted to know what's happening with the fish stocks. The data was very sketchy or unreliable. So the communities themselves wanted to collect information on a few different things, not just on the overall fish stocks, but on varied things like how I shared. Reef log is an entirely this, you know, it's entirely something that is a participatory knowledge generation data collection exercise, but you know there's not much for the participants in it, right? There's not too many stakes involved in it. It's just something that they can prefer to do or not to do. If you look at the stakes, uh, so who are the participants here? I think that's also something critical that one should consider when you're thinking of a citizen science program is who are those people that would be able to participate in it? Is this something that would be equally accessible to everybody? Are there certain kinds of prerequisites? How will we implement this? So what are the costs or benefits for the participants? All of those things are things that one needs to consider. And in the Panayur example, it was clearly the local residents who had a clear stake in it. And in Lakshadweep, it was primarily the fisher communities who were involved in the Polandine tuna fishing or in the fisheries of in these areas. They're the ones who had a big stake in participating in it, in running it, right? There were huge stakes for them. And for the reef log, like I said, it's a certain socioeconomic group who are the ones whom we expect will participate in these things. The others may not be able to participate in these kind of initiatives because it's not something that's accessible to all, right? The Panayur example was not when you were if you have to think of who are those creators of those protocols or the frameworks. So there the communities didn't have, in the Panayur example, they didn't have a say in how to construct it, but they all they did was implement it. And you know but in the other case, in Lakshadweep, it was an entirely co-created protocol, right? And same way in Reflog, it was again created by us, and we're getting recreational divers to participate in it. And who does it benefit? The Panayur example, clearly, I'm not going to get a academic paper out of that particular exercise, but it was primarily meant to be a tool to strengthen the hands of the community. So the the benefits for an exercise like that was entirely for the communities. The Lakshadweep, again, it was for the fisher communities and also for the fisheries managers as well in that area. For the reef log, it's basically the ones who started it. It's for us to get that data set. I mean, those who are contributing, we're trying to put in a system where they can actually go back and look at what all they've contributed. But for them, it's more of a satisfaction. But the actual tangible benefits are the ones who are running these programs, or for marine biologists in general, since it's going to be open access and available data sets, right? Again, some of these were short duration things. It didn't require more than the entire thing, from collecting the data to converting it into a report that could be used. The entire thing took just less than 2 months. The Lakshadweep initiative has been going on for 5 years, but at some point we'll have to revisit the protocols and see if you still need to continue collecting data sets from FADs, or do you need to change protocols. So since that's a co-created model, the decision will be a more collective one. Reflog is a clearly long-term thing, and I think as long as the data keeps coming and people are getting participation is happening, we would like to continue. There's no end to the amount of data one could collect there. So, in terms of the scope, also all of these are very, very different. And also in terms of data rights, the Panayur example, the data rights is entirely with the communities. Uh, you know, have no stake over those data sets, even though it helped facilitate it. Um, the Lakshadweep example, it's entirely with the communities, but it's a collective thing. Like I said, there are certain uh, agreements we have with the communities is that they don't give us wrong data sets, and we ensure anonymity of the participants. The reef log program is going to be an open source one, so whoever else is interested in those data sets can access and use those, right? And I've already discussed about the stakes involved and all of that. So there are multiple, you know ways in which these things. So I really do not know whether the Panayur example, for one, is a citizen science initiative, right? In the conventional way it's been understood and perceived. The Lakshadweep example is more like a you know participatory knowledge generation exercise. Even now, when these data sets are available, all the local fisheries management agencies are very hesitant in using the data set, saying that, it didn't follow this protocol, you didn't use a stratified random sampling methodologies and things like that. So for us, um, you know, more than the use of the data itself, it's the other benefits. Like I said, it leading you know, towards co-management and other things that is more exciting for us. Yeah, so that would I would kind of place it under a community-based monitoring program rather than a conventional citizen science program. And then reflog, like I said, is something that I feel would, you know, and the motivation for a lot of the people to participate in the reflog initiative is not because they have any stakes in it, or it's going to affect them if they participate or not participate in it. Clearly, participating in the fisheries monitoring program has some benefits for the communities, even though it's not clear, direct, tangible benefits. They do see value in those data sets over a period of time. But reflog is entirely an altruistic thing for people to participate in. So there's no stakes whatsoever for those for participants who are involving in that, right? So yeah, I'll wrap up my talk with some questions, and we can get into discussions and stuff. Yeah, so basically, how do we define citizen science, and what are some of those things that we need to consider before initiating a citizen science program? Like, for instance, if one were to think of inclusivity, um, you know, if we were to implement a similar fisheries monitoring program on the mainland, where not necessarily all fisher, communities would be equally literate or so comfortable engaging with numbers and data and tables and, writing them down, um, you know, how do you build programs that are ethical in many ways? So quite often, the other issue that, you know, one would encounter is with regards to ethics. Quite often, if you're involving a certain group of people to go out and collect data on, say, endangered birds in a particular area, and you've collected these data sets, how do you ensure that at some point or the other there's not going to be a new, you know protected area declared in that particular area, and the communities having no more access to those sites? Are we completely disclosing the pros and cons of participating in a certain exercise back with those communities? Are there conversations about how do you make things more? Can you define the citizens in citizen science? We use these terms very loosely, but when we say citizen science in the conventional manner, there is only a certain kind of citizens who can participate. And in a society that's already so inequitable, one needs to also probably consider, are we adding to those inequities and things like that, right? So yes, on that note, I will wrap up and take questions. I will see what points have been.
There are two questions in the chat box. The first from Apana. Don't the study face any discrepancies due to diving? Aren't the marine organisms being disrupted by divers?
Oh, yes, to some extent they would. There should be some level of disturbances that are happening. But on the scale of all the other disturbances that are happening, probably diving. I mean, there are places where diving is not being done properly, and then it becomes a completely commercial exercise, and with volumes and carrying capacities of certain areas not being factored in, there could be implications for reefs. But you know folks are anyway going to be diving in these areas. There's no way you or I can control these things, because it's a commercial activity that's happening, and no one can say that, hey, you are not allowed to go and dive and do it for your recreational purposes, while I can go and dive for my scientific purposes. So all these questions are there. So but the fact is that at some point or the other, how do you make these things, because diving is a revenue generator for the Andaman Islands, and a lot of people now depend on small jobs that they find in the dive industry to sustain their livelihoods. Now, banning diving entirely is not an option. Like I said, it's not a you know it's not a democratic approach to take, say. But there are areas that are set aside as inviolate zones as well, right? There are marine protected areas being set up and all of that. So you know in those areas you can regulate. But in a way, the amount of traction it generates among communities once they do a dive and come back, the amount of excitement they get having engaged, finished a dive and seen things firsthand, is actually much more useful as a tool to leverage an ocean literacy and an ocean concerned citizenry. So that way, it's not a bad tool to create more awareness and engagement. But since this is already happening, our objective is to use that to contribute to more data sets and things like that, rather than just doing it only for recreational purposes. And by engaging in any form of information collection and engaging with the additional materials that are being given to them, they gives them an opportunity to learn more, rather than just come and be passive divers and enjoy and go off, right? So yeah.
There's one more question, Prerna. What is your take on coral restoration in India? What are its impact, negative or positive, on marine wildlife?
Wow. Interesting that none of these questions have anything to do with citizen science, but yeah. uh, Coral restoration efforts, you know like any restoration effort, like afforestation for instance, you know in creating planting a lot more corals is possible, but recreating a reef is not the same as planting a it's like the same as planting a few trees doesn't make it a forest. But to for something to become a functional forest, or to become a functional, you know vibrant space with all its you know inherent values and all of that, aesthetic, utilitarian, all of that, you need to it's not an easy thing that to recreate. And particularly with coral restoration, not all species are you know render themselves to be propagated and grown the same way. Say for instance, branching corals can be you know propagated, and technology is still, I mean, things are happening. People are learning more and more. Research funds are being pumped into research and looking at restoration technologies. But I think for countries like India, it's way too many resource investment for very little returns, because the amount of recovery that happens is like I mean, the amount of resources you need to put into recreating a reef in India is actually much higher, and the technology and all of that is still way behind. So I would say focus more on reducing the impacts on existing ecosystems and try and manage them much more efficiently. You can have this at a experimental level, people trying it out in different places. I have no concerns with that. But to make it a alternate strategy has all the other problems. It will become an easy box to check later on to say that, okay, I'm doing a development project here. X acres of coral reefs are getting affected. In another area, I'll go and restore corals. And, it shouldn't become another tool for people to get away from, from the costs that they're levying on these systems.
There are no more questions in the chat box. If anyone else has any question, may send in the chat box or just turn the mic on.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'd also ask what comes to mind when you think of citizen science as an initiative. So even any of you, if you think of it, what is it that you think of when you think of citizen science?
Well, in my mind, like it's the word when I hear the word citizen science, it comes like many people just collaborating things, anything, any data or something for one particular cause or one particular research.
But then who initiates it?
Yes, like someone has to initiate, and some like group of people initiated a particular thing. That's the basic thing that first comes in the mind about citizen science.
Yeah. So
Like citizens themselves initiate a particular thing with help of the other rest of the citizens. They collaborate and aim and achieve their particular aim.
yeah, but why do you expect people to collaborate in your program? Is this just a cheap way of getting data done, or work done, and make people, participants, feel like, hey, I've done something exciting and I've contributed my 2 bits to science or to the environment or whatever, and let them off the hook?
Yeah, but it's the thing which we are contributing. It should help them back. The community, the thing should help, like the thing you are doing with the fishermen. So the data the fishermen are collecting, it is like it is helpful for them in the back. You're giving back the particular data. So in turn, they are like win-win situation for both sides.
So you're saying it needs to have a tangible benefit for the participant.
Maybe
Yeah,
like
does it need to?
or
I'm not saying this or that, right? I'm saying one could set up a citizen science, or I don't know why one should call it a citizen science program, but you could set up a science program and ask for volunteers to come and help you out with those things, and you know collect a particular data set, and then move on. Then you be very clear that you're joining only as some glorified field assistant or whatever. You might have a big job in an IT company, but right now you're just you know a data collector for my project. So you know that's fine. I don't have any problems with that, as long as people clearly define what is it that you want to do with your citizen science initiative. What are the benefits for me? What are the benefits for the others? If there's no benefit for the other participants, it's entirely out of your interest and your time availability, with it, no pressure that they're contributing. That's also fine. Who are the others to stop them from, I want to contribute to some whatever stargazing program and collect data on star alignments on a day-to-day basis? That's up to me. That's my passion, right? I can decide. So not always that you, I mean, I don't know, probably not necessary that always all these things have benefits for the participants, but then at least some thought need to be invested in terms of you know who can participate and who cannot, and all of that. Yeah,
yes.
I
So
can
I guess there are
loud as
no more
thin
questions.
significantly.
I guess it's like we should wrap up now. So thank you, sir, for this amazing session. We surely learned so much more from you. And thanks everyone for participating. I hope you loved this talk as much as we did. It is my honor to host all our future citizen scientists from all across the country. It was a pleasure to learn from you about opportunities and challenges along with a passion to save our environment. I have added some links in the chat box. Let me see. Yes. Both speaker profile and the Dakshin Foundation profile is also there, and our site and the YouTube channel where you can find the recorded session later is also there. So
Yeah.
thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you. Yeah.